our second feature panel titled Climate Change Risk and Opportunities. This panel delves deeper into the real implications behind a changing climate, what this means in terms of practical solutions and risks, and new approaches to development that take this reality into consideration. Focus on solutions, innovation, and technology. Special emphasis on Vancouver as a coastal city. Panelists will discuss the what is being done to reach the goals of the why, the regulatory framework needed, practical points on what a realistic approach to this challenge looks like. I'll take a brief moment to introduce our panelists. Our moderator today is Brittany Coughlin, yes, with RDH Building Science Incorporated. Brittany specializes in building energy conservation and efficiency. Her work includes energy assessments, energy studies, whole building energy modeling, research and guideline development related to energy efficiency. Brittany is an ASHRAE building energy modeling professional, a certified Passive House consultant, a Passive House Institute certifier, and a lead AP. She has presented at conferences across North America on a variety of topics related to energy consumption and conservation in buildings. Peter Moonen is BC's Municipal Affairs and National Sustainability Manager with the Canadian Wood Council. Peter works to assist designers and builders in understanding how to use wood to enhance environmental performance and reduce the ecological footprint of buildings. He regularly presents on achieving greater sustainability to various local, Canadian, and international groups. He is also a Canadian representative at the UN Timber Committee and a reviewer specializing in wood and green economy for the Forest Products Annual Market Review published by the United Nations Timber and Forestry section with special emphasis on the role of wood in green economy, including green design. In addition to a degree in marine biology and zoology, he studied forestry at UBC, as well as journalism and public affairs in Alberta. All right. Ralf Nielsen is Principal and Director of Sustainability for Colliers Project Leaders. Colliers Project Leaders has delivered over 150 LEED registered and certified green building projects in Canada, worth $4 billion in construction value. Ralf provides strategic guidance on the integration of sustainability into the company's operation and professional practice. He works with his CEO, Franklin Holt-Forster on company strategy, reporting, materiality, and industrial trends as outstanding advocates for sustainability in the design and construction industry. This duo has championed the company's sustainability is free philosophy, which situates sustainability integration into facility projects as an interpretive for future worth and return on investment. Carla Guerrera is a recognized leader in urban infill and redevelopment with a record of leading award-winning brownfield redevelopment and waterfront revitalization projects. She has played a lead role in the planning and development of $475 million in real estate and consultant on planning, design, regulatory issues, and development strategy. Perhaps the best known of the projects is West Don Lands, an 80-acre site on Toronto's waterfront. Formerly an industrial area and challenging brownfield, West Don Lands is now part of one of North America's largest and most advanced urban revitalization efforts. As a project manager for the waterfront Toronto, Guerrera played a central role in overall master planning for West Don Lands, as well as the first phase of development. The revitalization plan includes 6,000 new residents, affordable housing, significant office and employment space, schools, childcare, and art-filled public spaces, including the recent completed Underpass Park. I'll now turn this over to Brittany.
Thanks. I feel like after that last presentation, we should all be watching these standing up and moving our arms around. And now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the exciting innovations that are happening in buildings and in communities to solve the climate change challenges that we're facing. And let me just, oops. There we go. And I'm coming from the building industry and sustainable building, so I'm going to talk about a few different things that are happening that are really exciting. And really, this is all about counting greenhouse gas emissions. In the past, a lot of these conversations were around energy savings and reducing our energy consumption, reducing costs. But there's been a real shift in the last few years to instead talk about greenhouse gas emissions, which are related to energy savings but can change the conversation a little bit. And I think that the really exciting news is that we have solutions and we have strategies and programs that can really achieve deep energy and greenhouse gas savings in buildings. And we've seen a lot of momentum in the last few years with some of these programs and solutions taking off. And so I'm really excited to show you a few examples of those. I'm going to talk a little bit about net zero energy and carbon, passive house, existing building retrofits, and how we can develop strategies and codes and standards to move all of these things forward. So we hear a lot about net zero energy and net zero carbon for buildings, but what does this actually mean? When you think about it, any building can technically be net zero if we throw enough photovoltaics at it, or by the same measure, a building could also be net zero if we have really modest expectations for comfort, like a tent in the beautiful BC backcountry here. So we need a way to actually define net zero for each project and come up with a path to achieving net zero that actually makes sense and achieves our sustainability and carbon goals. And so we'd like to talk about this idea of getting to net zero the right way. And that kind of involves 3 steps. The first is to passively manage loads in buildings, so reducing the need for energy through well-insulated building enclosures, airtight enclosures, using daylight to reduce lighting needs, optimizing massing and orientation, and really doing everything we can to first reduce the need to provide energy to buildings. And then the second step is to use energy efficiently, so have efficient mechanical systems, have low energy LED lighting, use efficient equipment, and so on. And then the third piece of that is to then look at renewables so that we're not just throwing a bunch of renewables on a building, we're actually trying to get those loads down first and then getting that last step there through renewable energy. And there's a lot of different ways that programs and standards and codes are taking this approach to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in buildings. And I'm going to talk about a few different examples and some really exciting projects. This one, we're starting to see a lot more net zero projects happening, and this is an example that our firm is working on at Mohawk College in Ontario, the new Joyce Centre for Partnership and Innovation, and it's going to be a net zero building. And you can see the large amount of PV. It actually needs about twice as much PV as you see in this rendering here. So the building next door will have PV as well. But this really followed that path that I talked about, where we first looked at having a well-insulated enclosure. We looked at optimizing mechanical system energy by doing a study of different approaches: geothermal, solar photovoltaics, solar thermal, and then adding the renewable piece with PV as well to get that energy down. So there's a lot of exciting projects happening in net zero. This is also one of the pilots in the Canadian Green Building Council's new net zero carbon program. So I think we'll see a lot more of these net zero projects happening as well. And passive house follows a related approach when we talk about getting the loads down initially. And this is an image that talks about the fundamentals of passive house. And I know there's a few other seminars on this at your conference, but really having well-insulated enclosures with low U values, having an airtight enclosure, having a simple design that reduces thermal bridging and heat loss through things like uninsulated concrete balconies and corners and penetrations, optimizing our glazing so that we have solar heat gain from the sun when we want it, and we have shading and ventilation when we don't want it in cooling climates, and then using mechanical ventilation. And if we follow all of these fundamentals in buildings, we can actually reduce the need for heating by 75 to 90% compared to a typical building. So really, really low energy buildings. And it's been really exciting to see Passive House taking off both in North America and around the world. This is a plot from the Pembina Institute that shows the increase in Passive House square footage here in North America. And this is actually quite out of date now. There's even more in design, especially here in Vancouver, but across North America. But really, we've seen exponential growth as more projects pursue these fundamentals, and also around the world. I was really lucky to be at the Passive House conference in Vienna a few months ago, and there was tons of projects from China happening, of course lots in Europe, and really projects from every corner of the globe. So we're really starting to see more uptake in Passive House globally, and those sort of enclosure, passive, reduce the loads first approaches. And despite the name, Passive House isn't just for houses. All of these images here are different Passive House projects that are either built or still in design. The one at the far end is the Cornell Center in New York, a high-rise student residence that's going to be the tallest Passive House in North America. But we've got a lot here also locally. The bottom two are, there's a church and a medical office building that we're working on, multi-unit residential. There's one that's under construction here in Vancouver right now. And the one in the middle I'm going to show a few more examples of, or a few more photos of. This is the Bella Bella Passive House. It's a staff housing project in Bella Bella, BC, which is on the coast of British Columbia here. And I like this photo because it really shows you that enclosure first approach, sort of putting insulation all around the enclosure, having a really simple design with very little thermal bridging, airtight details. This is a picture. This building was done as prefabrication construction, so this is an example of some of our guys in the warehouse showing that detailing to have a really airtight window installation. Doing the airtightness testing before we got to site in this case, making sure it was really well sealed. And this project was actually shipped up to Bella Bella remotely, craned into place. And there's the final example too. So really neat little project, but a good example of how prefabrication construction could be used really cost effectively to have a well-insulated, airtight, low-energy building. And prefabrication isn't just for low-rise buildings either. This is a little video that you're seeing of a new Tallwood student residence, 18 stories, wood construction out at UBC. And this is really exciting because Tallwood construction is a way to, we're going to hear more about this from Peter, but can be a way to really cost-effectively implement highly insulated building enclosures, and kind of changes the conversation around what's achievable in terms of low-energy buildings for high-rise construction. So we're starting to see prefabrication and wood used in many more projects to achieve these sustainability goals. And we'll hear more about wood later as well. So I talked a bit about net zero and about Passive House, and what's also really exciting is that our building codes and our standards are pushing towards these same goals as well. Here in British Columbia, we have a new energy step code that follows a very similar approach to Passive House, where we have what's called a thermal energy demand intensity that requires us to reduce the heating loads. We have a total energy use intensity that limits the total energy consumption of the building, and we also have airtightness requirements. So really following that same step of reducing the loads and then using energy efficiently before we have our future goal of net zero. And energy modeling is going to be a really big part of this as well. The targets that I showed you in that last slide are all demonstrated through energy modeling. So here locally, many projects are already using modeling as a design tool to cost-effectively optimize buildings and meet these goals. And I think even more projects will be making use of modeling to do that going forward. A lot of organizations are developing a roadmap. So it's one thing to say, you know, we want to be at net zero in all of our buildings by 2030 or whatever the year is, but we need a path that lets us get there and looks at the economics and how we're actually going to achieve those goals. And so these are some of the organizations that we've been working with locally to do this. And I put in a few slides of an example of some of the analysis that we do, where we look at the energy savings and the cost effectiveness of achieving different energy efficiency goals. And so this is an example of a few different packages of measures. We've done some archetype energy modeling studies where we model a building, we look at all these potential energy upgrades, we look at the costs and the savings associated with that, and we put some packages together to look at what standards and metrics are achievable. And you can see this is just a short example, but the first bundle is a group of energy efficiency measures that are cost effective right now, they're positive net present value. It makes sense that we start doing these now. And then some of the deeper energy measures are not quite cost effective yet, they still still have negative net present value. But when we actually compare them to renewable energy prices in the context of net zero energy and net zero carbon, they become very cost effective. So as the conversation changes around achieving these deeper goals and looking at renewable energy, we can also change the conversation around what makes sense for buildings and look at how we get there cost effectively. We talk a lot about new buildings and what's happening in that realm, but about 70% of the buildings that will be here in 2030 already exist today, and so it's maybe even more important that we're also looking at retrofitting our existing buildings to achieve deep energy and deep carbon reductions. And this is really possible, and we've worked on a few different studies looking at that. We find that this work is most cost effective when done at the time of renewals. So if you're already changing your windows or replacing your boiler, already doing work at the building, it becomes quite cost effective to then incorporate energy and GHG reduction measures. And the other point about it is that it's highly cost effective compared to low carbon energy solutions. So rather than trying to build new power plants that are zero carbon or low carbon, a large solar field or a low carbon district energy system, it's actually more cost effective to retrofit the buildings to be ultra low energy or zero carbon. And I've shown some examples here of a building in Vancouver that we did recently that was going through a large renewals project anyways, and the owners took it upon themselves to use that as a time to implement deep energy and deep carbon reductions. So they added exterior insulation to the outside of the building, they put in new triple glazed fiberglass frame windows, they reduced air leakage by 55% at the building, and they're now looking at implementing some ventilation measures to put heat recovery ventilation in the suites. And all of this was done very cost effectively at the time that they were already doing renewals, and they were able to reduce energy significantly. They actually saw a 65% reduction in heating energy in the building. So a really great example of using the renewals as an opportunity to also make some big improvements in the existing building. So that's a really quick snapshot of some of the exciting things that are happening in the building industry. Net zero passive house, codes and standards, and existing building retrofits. We're going to hear a few more different innovations from a few different perspectives here, and then once we've gone through the rest of the panel, we'll circle back and take some questions. So I'll turn it over to Peter.
Just waiting for it to show up here. So I'm going to talk to you about carbon, since Brittany stole some of my wood pictures. But there's good carbon and there's bad carbon. Each of us depends on carbon from for air filters we have, fire extinguishers, some women who have large diamond rings. That's all just carbon there, Brittany. But there's also bad carbon. So we're going to try to focus on some of the things around the carbon that we don't want. This is a picture of a graph showing the ups and downs of the carbon concentration in the atmosphere taken at Mauna Loa in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. I'm going to come back to that, but I want you to remember that and think about why it's doing what it's doing. But first, I'm going to ask, does anybody know who this is? Can anybody tell me why I would have a picture of a guy from 3,750 years ago on my screen? If I said the name Hammurabi, would that mean anything to any of you? Who is Hammurabi? Sorry? Well, Hammurabi wrote the first code for civil society and the first building code. So I want you to take a look at this building code. Do you think it's a pretty good building code? It's not prescriptive. It's performance-based, outcome-based. How many of you have kids? How many have children? Might want to suggest they stay away from being an architect, engineer, or contractor if that was our building code. The reason I had that picture there is because the first building code has changed significantly, And these days, there's a lot of emphasis on the decarbonization of the built environment that is being incorporated into our building codes. It's happening from both an operational point of view, but also from an embodied point of view, from the building to building point of view. As you can see in Europe, there's several countries that require life cycle analysis. They're focusing on energy in the building operations as well as energy in the materials that go into it. And it's really focusing on reducing total carbon. In Canada, the Canada Green Building Council, just a month and a half ago, launched their carbon project to really inspire and enable people to reduce carbon in the building operations and the building itself. And so has the City of Vancouver. Their policies came into effect on May 1st that requires reporting of embodied impacts. But from a wood perspective, wood does play a role in reducing carbon footprint. And it's not really the 3S of sink, sequester, substitute. It starts with sustainable forestry. Dr. Suzuki mentioned the importance of forests in his presentation today. And I think we in Canada are blessed with having a very large forest land base that is generally very well managed. Forests are important because deforestation accounts for about 20% of our global greenhouse gases. And there's a difference between deforestation and logging. Deforestation, as defined by international agreement, is the conversion of forests to another land form, whether it's agriculture, whether it's a plantation of single trees, or whether it's a parking lot. That accounts for deforestation. Most of the deforestation is occurring between the tropics. China, for example, is, however, growing more new forests than the rest of the world combined. Countries in the north, where all that gray is, tend to have a deforestation level that is very, very low. And in Canada, it's about 0.02%. Most of that coming from urban expansion. So our forest resource is ever changing, but it's also very stable. Now, I come back to this photo. Can anybody tell me why it might go up and down? Any guesses? Sorry? Summer is where and winter is where? That's exactly right, dude. Winter season in the northern hemisphere, where most of the world's forests grow, sees an increase in CO2. Why is that? Because of the essential process, photosynthesis, that Dr. Suzuki mentioned, is not occurring as much in the winter than the summer. And you can see that the difference between forests and winter and summer is a significant increase or decrease in CO2. A forest tends to stabilize. As forests get older, there are fewer trees, they're bigger, sort of like people. They grow tall and they get big around the middle, and there's fewer of us as we get old. But forests and wood have three ways to reduce carbon. One is locking it up into the forest. But as you can see, over time, the forest tends to stabilize. It can only absorb so much carbon, even though individual trees get much bigger. But if we use wood and lock that carbon dioxide up into a long-lived product, we're sequestering that CO2 and delaying the re-emission into the atmosphere. But there's another way that we can also reduce the carbon, and that's by substituting for materials that might have a higher CO2 impact. So one of the first pictures I showed was sink, sequester, and substitute. Sink it into the forest, sequester it into our long-lived buildings and furniture and that, and substitute for materials that have greater emissions. In fact, when the IPCC came out with their report in 2007, they said that the single biggest mitigation method for climate change, and Ralf will cover this a bit in mitigation, is to grow more forest land, like China is doing, grow more wood and trees on that land, and use more wood from sustainable long-term forests. The single biggest way to mitigate climate change. Life cycle analysis is a tool that's really essential for determining what is the actual impact of what we're doing and the choices we make. This particular one shows the total embodied carbon of a building in Australia. But what I found interesting about this is that the energy efficiency standards that deal with the energy for heating and cooling account for 24% of the life carbon of that building. The embodied carbon that goes into building and moving the materials accounted for 35%. So embodied impact is important. There's a life cycle tool being developed in Quebec for the Quebec government that is looking at a system of assemblies. And as quantity surveyors, this may be of interest to you because you can't know every single way to design a building. But when you're being tasked with contributing to reducing the carbon footprint, tools like this may be of use for you in the future. What this, as an example, one of the things they did was compared a steel deck and steel and concrete deck with a wood frame system that performs the same job, can be built under this in the same code, and is basically the same area. So they compared a 6 meter by 6 meter steel and concrete solution, and as you can see, 1,600 kilograms of CO2 was the impact of that particular system. The same floor, doing the same job in the same building and allowed by code, built out of wood for this particular building, was 276. So look at 1633 versus 276. It's not always that much of a difference, but what the tool is designed to do is to help you determine what path you might want to take. This is the life impact of a building over its 80 years, which is typically over 80 years, a building would have about 12 to 20% embodied in the building and 80% from operations. But let's look at this. In year 0, 100% of the impact is in the building. Here's your keys, turn on the light, you start having operational impacts. Year 1, year 5, year 10, at year 12, on an 80-year cycle, the operational and the embodied are equivalent. After this, the operational impact increases. Year 15, 20, 25, 30, 50, 60, 80. But what could go wrong? What happens if the building is not well maintained? What happens if it is really well maintained and well operated? What if someone says, I'm tired of that building, I want to change its look? What if the land value goes up, as it does in Vancouver, and building is worth more torn down and rebuilt than kept and operated? All of these things can change the relative importance of what the building, how the building is made, and what the operational impact. And that's important. Research out of Montreal shows that a ton of carbon saved today is equivalent to saving a little more than 4 tons in 80 years. Just like the interest on your retirement plan or a savings plan, you hope that the first dollar you put in is going to be worth more to you when you retire than the last dollar you put in. Carbon has a time interest benefit or impact. Brittany talked about passive design. There was a conference here a couple of years ago, and a woman from the IPCC presented on the fastest, the best, and the least expensive way to reduce our global energy use, and it was to build with passive. So it is the whole aspect of retrofitting that Brittany talked about is something we really have to get our heads around. But let's look at that Pac-Man and lemon meringue pie drawing if it's passive. There's a slightly higher embodied impact in the building, about 2% greater. And in year 1, your impacts are low. Year 5, year 30, 80. So at the end of 80 years, the heating and cooling operational impact and the electrical use by that building is 46% in this particular passive building. The embodied is 54. That's the energy that would have been used by a conventional performing building. It's about 1/3 the total embodied and operational carbon of building a passive building than building a conventional one. So what are some of the carbon considerations? I mentioned sink, sequester, substitute, and time. Operations or building performance is also the other one. Think about how you're designing these buildings because operations and embodied are important. I'm often asked, why should I build with wood? And there was a little old lady who asked me, and she's about the age of my mother, so I had to be polite. She said, I really love wood, but I don't think we should cut down trees to get it. And I can understand that. I live in a forested area, and cutting down trees can be hard. But I told her, I said, when someone invents a material that is all of these things, it's a carbon sink, it's renewable, reusable, recyclable, organic, cleans the air, cleans the water, provides habitat, provides recreation, avoids CO2, is strong, lightweight, flexible, diverse, easy to use, beautiful, and ubiquitous, and cheap. I think I'll stick with wood. And when they do invest with that, I would like to know so I can invest in that. So the question shouldn't be why wood, but if not wood, what? If we're going to continue to build, we have to be aware of what we build it with and how we build it and how that building's going to be used. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. My name is Ralf Nielsen. I would like to thank the organizing committee. David, thanks for the introduction. Welcome everybody to beautiful British Columbia. I hope many of you who have traveled from far away around the entire Pacific Rim are going to spend a few more days in Vancouver or perhaps in other parts of British Columbia and take in some of that wonderful biodiversity and the lifestyle and the quality of life that we have, that we're so blessed with here in Vancouver. I would like to build a little bit upon what Brittany and Peter have spoken about in terms of, we've been talking about climate change and a lot of discussion around mitigation, how to reduce our GHG footprint. I'd like to speak a little bit more about adaptation and get into that in terms of what are the critical things that we see coming down the pipe that we need to do in the next 10, 15 years to really adapt to a new climate reality. I hope all of you are ready for that climate reality because the climate is going to change, and it's going to change in sometimes extreme ways. This is an illustration of the number of days that are going to be above 40 degrees Celsius in Australia. And I think I have a laser pointer. So this is 1990, this is 2050, and this is 2100. And you can see the substantial difference just in temperature in Australia over the next 83 years, let alone the next 33 years. So we are, as a species, as human beings, as mammals, are going to have to adapt. Now, we are very good at adapting. I like the word adaptation more than I like the word resilience. When I think of resilience, I think of a rubber ball that is going to be impacted by something, and then it's going to bounce back to its original shape. And I don't think we actually have the ability or really the luxury of bouncing back to our original shape. Many professionals in our industry talk about resilient communities and resilient cities. Do we really just want to bounce back from a climatic event to more extreme weather events and just bounce back to where we were before? I don't think we have that luxury. I think we actually have to adapt to a new climate reality. So there are several, actually there are probably hundreds of other similar graphs to this for every Pacific Rim, if not global country in the world, that deal with temperature, humidity, rain, rain on top of snow, freeze-thaw cycles. All the data is already there. So what is mitigation? Really, mitigation is about responding to that, to climate by reducing its impacts, reducing its severity. Brittany and Peter spoke about all the amazing things that we're trying to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. We're switching fuels. The Pacific Institute of Climate Solutions has indicated that there's two main ways in which we can get to net zero emissions in British Columbia here alone. One is changing our construction materials from concrete and steel to wood. That's one. And the second one is moving from fossil fuels to electricity. I asked the head of the Institute, how are we going to double our electricity production in the next 50 years to be able to do that? That's a key challenge. We don't know that yet. We don't know how we're going to actually do that. But I believe as human beings, we're actually going to be able to adapt to a new changing reality. So what is adaptation? adapt is actually from a French word. So in the 15th century, the English took the French word adapter, and adapter is actually from the Latin adaptar, and meaning to fit, and adaptus also meaning to fit or apt. And I think that what we are in a situation right now is we have to find our way in which we can fit. As Dr. Suzuki described this morning, we have to understand where we fit in our climate, in our globe, in our natural environment again. So that's going to require us to change how we act as human beings. It's also going to require how we change our organizational strategy, our organizational focus, and then as well as our policies. Interesting enough, I think a lot of this is going to require local knowledge, because climate impacts are going to be different depending on where you live. If you're living higher up, you don't necessarily really concerned about key rain events. But if you're living on the floodplain, you have to adapt to higher volumes of rain events. Number one thing I would suggest is we look at risk. Assess our risks for the long term. Organizational risks, risk to our communities, risk to our homes, risk to our families. And I'm not going to go through a risk 101 session for you, but I'm happy to do so if anybody wants to talk about how to do risk management or risk assessment with respect to climate change. But there are many tools that are out there. Engineers Canada has developed one of the fantastic tools, which is the PIEVC Vulnerability Assessment Protocol. Canada, I would say, is a leader in developing risk assessment and vulnerability tools for use by architects, engineers, planners, and perhaps even quantity surveyors. As I mentioned, it requires local knowledge. Second aspect is we need good data. We design our current infrastructure, our buildings, be it vertical buildings or horizontal infrastructure, we design them based on climate data that's from the past, based on climate norms. I was just speaking before lunch about the precipitation data that we use in energy modeling is 50 years old. So we are not looking at data into the future. We have to actually model that, and there are many models out there for us to actually pull from to say, what is the climate going to be in that 80-year time horizon that Peter spoke about? And how are we going to design our buildings and infrastructure to meet that new climate norm? And there's much work going underway with Environment Canada and the engineering and design community to get that future data actually into the modeling and into the engineering tools so that we can actually make better informed design decisions to prepare our infrastructure for a different future climate. The third critical element, I think, is how we actually practice, the knowledge base that we have within our professional disciplines. We all have different roles to play within the development of a piece of infrastructure or building, whether you're a quantity surveyor, an architect, an engineer, an electrical engineer, a mechanical or structural engineer. We all have different roles to play. The different professional associations have different levels of ability and currently initiatives to actually inform their membership and bring up that standard of level of knowledge within the professions. Level of knowledge is probably the most important thing to do right now, but eventually it's going to come down to duty of care. There's going to be a sense of responsibility that we have to build into our professional code of ethics and conduct. And I believe that we will be held accountable by our clients for designing for the future, just as we spoke this morning about the youth holding the government of the United States accountable for protecting our environment. And we have to understand our legal exposure as a result of that. And then finally, I think we need to think about different tools. It's not acceptable that we are just going to perpetuate the same way of working into the future. I would believe that, and I would hope, that we are going to be looking at innovative ways in which we organize the way in which we work contractually between the professions, getting engaged, getting involved with all the disciplines as early as possible to help the client set themselves up for success. So I'm speaking about integrated project delivery. We've spoken a lot in the last 2 decades about integrated design or integrative design, and now we're going to have to move towards a way in which we can actually, our clients can reward us and we can reward our clients around striving for higher performing pieces of infrastructure that, yes, reduce our emissions, but also adapt for a future climate. That's going to mean innovations in how we actually contractually work with each other. Some shared risk and some shared reward on the table. I think it's also going to change in a way in which we see success for a particular project. So I really am appreciative to be a part of this, this conference, and it was really inspiring to hear Dr. Suzuki this morning speak about applying our foresight, because really I think climate change adaptation is really about applying foresight in what we do. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carla Guerrera, and I'm the founding principal of Purpose-Driven Planning and Development. But before I get started, I have a really riveting presentation to share with you, as did my colleagues. But before I get started, I'm going to take a cue from our brain expert and have everyone just stand up and take a little stretch. Why not? Panelists?
Yeah.
Let's get some oxygen flowing. I'm concerned about everyone's brain health. All right. Feel better? Good. So I'm happy to join you today in what will be a presentation that's focused on transforming the built environment to integrate climate action into every urban development project. Why? Because I believe that it is the most potent weapon that we have against climate change. And just out of curiosity, how many of you here today are involved in an indirect or a direct way in an urban development project? Let's raise our hands. Okay, great. So urban development in cities are major contributors to climate change, and although they only cover 2% of the Earth's surface, they contribute to 78% of the world's energy and produce more than 60% of global CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions. So this presentation will demonstrate why and how urban development is our most potent weapon against climate change. And also, I'll look at providing 10 demonstrated best practices from globally recognized projects that we can integrate into any urban development project. The key to our future may be to borrow the mindset and the ideas from the first stewards of the land, where we're gathered today in the unceded territory of our coastal First Nations people. Unsustainable land use patterns have major long-term impacts on climate change in numerous ways, and there's an enormous amount of science and research that back this up. We could actually spend all day and all week talking about that research and the science. But in a nutshell, the premise is this: the more that we spread out in single-use, automobile-dependent urban development, the more we must drive. And the more we spread out in this kind of unsustainable land use pattern, the more we are depleting our natural areas that we need to absorb the carbon that is contributing to climate change. It's a dangerous, slippery slope, and it's rapidly compounding the impacts of climate change. And this, unfortunately, continues to be the prevailing dominant urban development pattern that we see unhinged across North America. To be responsible in a post-carbon world, we really have to shift this understanding and practice of supporting and creating automobile dependence and single-use zoning. Greenhouse gas emissions from urban travel is the direct result of unsustainable urban development, and it's It's comprised of a third of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada and the US, and it's the fastest growing segment. If we compound this with what's happening in China, with the largest human population boom in history, if our North American suburban lifestyles and our North American automobile-dependent patterns are to be continued in places where the population is expanding in such ways, well, you can just only imagine the exponential crisis that presents for climate change. It's a chilling thought. And if we think of it today, if we think today that we're on a train that's headed towards a cliff at 50 kilometers an hour, this would be like pressing the acceleration to 1,000 kilometers an hour. And as we reach the edge of that cliff, the less chance the brakes will actually work at all. It's both enriching to this discussion and respectful to really understand that for over 10,000 years, First Nations communities have had an intricate, respectful, physically dependent, and protective tie to the land. And as stewards of the land, our First Nations people believe that they are bestowed with a responsibility to the land and all creatures that inhabit it. These core values of our coastal First Nations people can really inform our thinking and our mindset around climate change. Indigenous land stewardship and sustainability practice are over 10,000 years old. The practices that we're now trying to move back to are really stemming from these core values that the First Nations communities hold. Good urban development practices leads to fewer people consuming fewer resources, less land, and fewer greenhouse gas emissions at a global scale. So good urban development really is like an antibiotic for climate change. It also is the single most potent weapon, not only against climate change, but against rising energy costs, as well as environmental degradation. So what are those 10 global best practices that we need to incorporate into our work and into our projects? The first is complete communities. Complete communities are communities where our daily needs can be met within walking distance, which is a 500-meter radius. This example here is a project that I led in Toronto with an organization called Waterfront Toronto. It's called the West Don Lands, and it's an 80-acre contaminated industrial site that we transformed into a mixed-use, complete community that was pedestrian-focused and where destinations for daily living were accessible within walking distance, where people can walk from home to work, to school, to shop, to recreate, and to engage in any activity of their daily life. And the entire neighborhood was planned around transit. Reducing the carbon footprint of urban development requires us to maximize the active use of space and land. So a single-use, low-density residential development or a business park in a suburban area are typically underutilized for most parts of the day. On the other hand, a vibrant, densely populated urban development is well used around the clock, all days of the week and all seasons. Another key principle is around incorporating transit into the way we plan these urban developments. We must reorient our thinking by shifting from car-centered urban development to transit-oriented urban development. And in this project, again, the West Don Lands development, we, early in the stages of this project, brought the Transit Authority to the table, recognizing that by putting 6,000 new residential units and 1 million square feet of commercial space, this neighborhood needed transit to be servicing the community and connecting to the rest of the city. So in any projects we're involved with, it's our responsibility to proactively engage the transit authorities and bring them to the table with our land use projects. Reducing car dependency is a key objective and imperative, and resilient communities reduce their carbon footprint by ensuring people want to walk or cycle instead of using the car. And this is fundamental to how we design these streets. Connectivity is another central tenet of making an area pedestrian and bike-oriented. Streets and walkways must be enjoyable to walk. They must link destinations that people want to go to, and they must operate at a fine scale. It's a common misconception that wide streets are more efficient and better for communities. Research is showing us that denser networks of narrower streets better optimize traffic flow, create more direct routes, and improve safety for pedestrians and cyclists. Avoiding gridlock requires limiting the use of vehicles, limiting the number of vehicles in our streets. And there are many ways to discourage driving. Many cities, like Vancouver included, restrict parking to popular destinations that are served with transit. Other cities, like Bologna, where I lived, only allowed cars to come into the city if they had an even or odd license plate on certain days of the week. This example here is a new street typology that we introduced in Toronto in the project I led that is called a woonerf. And a woonerf is a Dutch term which means shared space street. So the idea with this new street typology is to design it for people and bikes first, and cars can use it, but as a visitor. The optimal metric of the success of a woonerf is children playing in the street. So needless to say, when I saw this image, I was absolutely thrilled. Building off the Indigenous principles that I talked about of needing to manage the land as stewards for future generations and minimize disturbance to natural areas, we must focus our urban development projects and efforts into areas that have existing servicing and infrastructure, instead of sprawling mindlessly into natural areas. Most cities, I'm sure all of the cities that you're all from, have areas that are underutilized, have areas that are contaminated, and have areas that are low density. These are the areas of focus for urban development projects. And interestingly, from a development perspective, these are the areas where there's the most investment, most return on the investment, because they have the amenities and they're well located. In this project alone, we were able to achieve in the first of 4 phases $650 million in revenue and unlock $10 billion in development in the adjacent areas around it, obviously generating millions of dollars in tax revenue to the City of Toronto. As my panelists have spoken about, we also need to look at adopting net zero energy building design or passive house design so that the buildings themselves have zero emission design standards. The last principle that I want to speak about is including systems for district energy to support urban development by generating emissions-free energy in an efficient way that's centrally distributed. This model right here is from Dockside Green, which is a climate positive project in Victoria that uses a district energy system and takes biomass from wood waste that is used to fuel the energy for the neighborhood. We need to take this integrated approach to the transformation that needs to happen within the context of urban development. This sector absolutely needs to turn this train around and start to create climate positive action in the built environments. So no matter where you work in this integrated model, we all have a role that we can play to transform the needs of our communities and of our development to have a positive impact on the future. There are a growing number of examples that look at climate positive urban development and transform the way we develop while producing strong returns on investment for the investors. We are not innovating here anymore. These are projects that are demonstrated, they're tried and true, and they are transforming the market. This is not innovation, it's an imperative. These practices are thousands of years old. It's no longer a luxury of choice for us to transform what's not working and clearly broken in our current development patterns. Addressing climate change is our professional obligation to our industry, and we need to accept it as such. And finally, and most importantly, the imperative is a personal one. It's the obligation we have to our children. We've seen the science. There's consensus on it. We have the expertise, we have the knowledge, we have the practices, and we have seen the success of the globally recognized projects that are doing this. And it's absolutely our time now for all of us to take this on as an obligation to create the transformation in the urban development context in the cities that we live. It's time to now unleash the potent weapon that we're all holding against climate change and to turn the train around. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I found it so interesting to hear from really different perspectives, the diversity of solutions and ideas and actual projects that are happening to address climate change and move these things forward from a variety of different industries and perspectives. So we're going to open it up to questions next. And I think, do we ask people with questions to come to the mic here? So if anyone wants to come forward and ask a question, I'm going to get us started with one question while you think about it and come up to the mic. But we talked a lot about different ideas and solutions, and I really liked how, Carla, you mentioned that, it's market transformation, that these things are already starting to happen. We need to expand it and transform the market to make it the norm and not just these exceptional projects. So I'd really like to hear from each of you on how you see that happening. Is it government-driven? Is it incentive-driven? Is it owner-driven? From each of your perspectives, how do we actually move these ideas forward so that it becomes the normal that we always design our buildings this way and not just these unique projects here and there?
Okay, hi. I think one of the things that's coming to mind for me a lot is and I look at the Vancouver context, and it seems that the city of Vancouver is actually doing a lot with its vision for, greenest city by 2020, its net zero energy policy, which is the second to be adopted in North America. We're seeing municipalities really lead in this area, but I see the industry and the professional associations really lagging behind. And so I believe, and Ralf talked about this a little bit as well, I believe that as professionals and the knowledge and the skills and the expertise that we all have, as well as the other experts that we have access to, I believe it's really a professional obligation that needs to come through stronger on these issues so that we can be the leaders with our clients and we can bring this expertise forward and show our clients and partners that these are no longer new practices. These are practices that have been demonstrated. These are, projects that are showing success. And I think it's our obligation to do that. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement there.
Thanks, Carla. I think that there's probably two critical things that can really help. One is, and I totally agree on the professional obligation perspective. One is partnerships. I think there's a tension right now globally between private and public interest, and the opportunities for partnerships between municipalities or provincial governments or even national governments to partner with the private sector, because we're not going to solve the problems as individual sectors, really. We all have a moral imperative, and probably that's the second key point, is that, as Dr. Suzuki mentioned this morning, air, water, soil, those are the fundamental building blocks that we all need to feel morally are at the top of our list. And then hopefully over the next, decade or so, maybe 2 decades, we will actually be working in a system that puts them at the top, so that we are not driven by, our daily chore of earning a salary and having to, having those priorities or our clients' priorities not consider those 3 elements. So I think there's the partnership opportunity, and then I think just a fundamental moral imperative we all have to embrace and say, this is what we are going to do.
taking a page from Terry's presentation, if each of us is a synapse and we connect with other people, our power is going to be greater. And that gets to the collaboration that Ralph's talking about. I don't know about you, but I'm not smart enough to know everything. My kids thought I was, and then they became teenagers, and that was proven wrong. But I think we don't have to know everything, but we have to know who we can go to so that we can find out. And I think that connectivity between the quantity surveyors, the architects, the contractors, the regulators, the policymakers, the people who are supplying materials, and the people who want to own and operate and occupy these buildings. Each of those people needs to play a role in connecting you with them, and then these structures that we're charged with building and designing and building and operating with the greater needs of soil and air and water, and what the impact of our choices has on those. So if we strive to connect and learn either something new every day, or one new person who knows more than we do every day, I think that will be a really strong way to help build the collaboration and the sense of community in how we build and design our buildings.
Thanks. Are there any questions from the audience here? Yeah, please, if you can make your way up to the microphone or shout really loud. Sure. Great question, and I'll repeat it just in case it didn't make it to the other side. The question was around, particularly as quantity surveyors, how are we doing at measuring things? Do we have enough ways of measuring, or are there other ways we need to be looking at that? Does anyone want to start?
Sure. Go ahead.
For design and engineering, I think we have more than sufficient ways in which to measure what's going to happen. I go back to my presentation about a future climate. Whether or not, and I can't speak to the quantity surveyor profession, whether it has enough of that built into the tools and methodologies. But I think that it starts with asking the question. I think if we engage, even in projects that I run, I engage quantity surveyors on maybe every second project. And sometimes I forget to ask the question of my client. But I would expect that over time, the other professionals that are working on my team or on the client's team, they would ask the question. And bring up the dialogue that Peter's talking about, because without dialogue, there's no decision making, and without decision making, we're just on the same path.
Yeah. I think sometimes we have too many things that we can measure, and those items will often come in conflict with the one thing that all of us are tasked with measuring: how much does it cost? And I think we sometimes confuse what does it cost with what is it worth. What is it worth today? What is it worth tomorrow? What is it going to be worth down the road? And I think there's a changing set of values. But as Ralf said, you've got to ask the right questions at the very beginning, so that you, as professionals, know what you're supposed to be focusing on. Because if the right question doesn't get asked at the beginning, then the wrong metrics will be chosen. And as I say, I think there's way too many metrics. It's are we choosing the right ones? And that starts with asking that question: what do we need?
I'll add a couple of thoughts to that too. I think that I agree with some of the previous comments about we're measuring a lot of things, and it's hard to make sure we're measuring the right things. But I think one thing from my perspective that we should be doing more of is circling back to our measurements and checking on how we did. And for me, that might be, looking at a building that we designed from an energy efficiency standpoint and doing measurement verification and measuring how much did it actually use, not just how much did we model. And also from a cost effectiveness standpoint, we do so many costing studies where we're projecting the incremental costs of energy efficiency measures and the payback period and net present value and whatnot. But how much did that actually cost on the last project, and really relying on actual, measured data to inform the next studies. I think it's important to do more of that. And then the second thought that I'll add is maybe thinking about informing our measurements in new ways. And I talked about we've always looked at counting energy savings, and now we want to look at GHG emissions. And so how can we justify some of these measures and projects from a more creative way? So looking at not just the simple payback period, but looking at the life cycle costs and maintenance costs. And thinking about comfort and all of these other things that people care about that are sort of side benefits that aren't just the cost. So finding different ways to measure and sell these types of projects that don't just look at the traditional costing metrics that we've always looked at.